Okay, all right, so in this video, we're going to look at Burns and MAN Automotive. And the key principles in this case really concern mitigation, although you can see in this case how mitigation interacts with remoteness principles as well, okay, because of the joint judgment, which we'll talk about in a moment. All righty, I'm just going to wait for this. My top screen always comes down. Anyway, it's fine. I can't start my slideshow sometimes when I want to. All right, we got this. Let us begin. All right, so as mentioned, this case is really around mitigation principles, although it touches a little bit on remoteness as well, in particular around the losses that are within the reasonable contemplation of the parties. All right, so in this case, the plaintiff bought a prime mover off the defendant, MAN Automotive. Now, MAN Automotive had sold the prime mover on the basis that it was fully reconditioned. So they'd warranted that it was reconditioned, but turns out it hadn't been. So they'd breached that warranty. So there's that breach of contract. The plaintiff didn't realise at first that the prime mover was defective. So they realised in 1978, so a year after they had bought it, that the prime mover was fully defective and essentially either needed to be fully reconditioned or else just replaced. The defendant refused to fix the engine. The plaintiff didn't have money to pay for the reconditioning. And as a result of the defective machinery, the plaintiff's business operated at a loss for a further 3 years after they discovered that the prime mover essentially was defective and needed to be replaced or else 100% reconditioned the engine. And the plaintiff here sought to recover both expectation and reliance losses, and I'll get into that in more detail in the case reading guide slide in a moment. The key issue here that arose was whether the plaintiff's failure to fix the engine amounted to a failure to mitigate. So because here the plaintiff couldn't actually afford to have the engine fully reconditioned, it was that question was raised around whether their ability to afford it, how that, I guess, interacted with that requirement that, you know, you only have that duty to mitigate when it's reasonable for you to do so. So reasonableness and, you know, affordability are tied together in this instance. So here it was held that the plaintiff's duty to mitigate their damage doesn't require them to do that which is unreasonable. And, you know, their financial position does come into that consideration of reasonableness and unreasonableness. So essentially, if someone can't afford to mitigate their losses, there won't be a failure to mitigate. However, here it was held that it wasn't reasonable for the defendant to continue to carry on with their business with a defective prime mover once they knew that they had no prospect of making a profit. So what this essentially meant under the joint judgment was that the profits or the losses, after the time they knew that the prime mover was like 100% defective wasn't recoverable because those losses following on from that point weren't within the reasonable contemplation of the parties at the time of contracting. Okay, so the joint judgment dealt with this issue not essentially as a mitigation issue at all, but as a remoteness issue. So they limited the recovery after that date, okay, that the person knew, the plaintiff knew that the prime mover needed to be replaced or fully reconditioned, okay. We'll come back to that in a sec on the case reading slide. So essentially here, the plaintiff only recovered the damages incurred prior to the discovery that machinery was defective. All right. All right, so in terms of our case reading guide, the first question was Burns's claim for damages was based upon, which two main heads of loss? So here there was both expectation and reliance loss. So there was the loss of the profit for the 4 years. So that first 1 year before they realized the machinery was 100% defective, the engine, and then the 3 years that followed when they continued to operate despite knowing that they were going to only operate at a loss because of the engine needing to be replaced. So that was the expectation loss plus losses incurred as a consequence of the breach. So the reliance loss here would be those initial costs of repairs that they had in the first year. Okay, but it was the expectation loss that was controversial, as mentioned. Okay, so the next question was, why did the majority hold that the plaintiff should not recover loss of profits from the interstate haulage after the first year of the contract, nor should they be allowed to recover actual losses incurred after July 1978. Okay, so that was the time at which the plaintiff knew or became aware that, you know, the prime mover was not going to be able to be used profitably. Okay, so that was at the point at which they became aware that the engine needed to be fully reconditioned or the prime mover just needed to be replaced. Okay, so, and the reason why the joint judgment held that the losses after that time weren't recoverable was because the loss had to be within the reasonable contemplation of the parties, and it wasn't within the reasonable contemplation of the parties at the time of contracting that if this situation had eventuated, that someone would continue to carry on with a business that they knew wasn't profitable. And remembering, of course, that the plaintiff wasn't locked into a pre-existing contract with someone, you know, with someone else that they had to continue to deliver, you know, throughout these 4 years. They were choosing to do this. They were choosing to operate at a loss, and that was held to be not within the Hadley and Baxendale reasonableness test there. Reasonableness, remoteness test, I mean, although it is reasonable. Anyway, cool story. Moving on. Okay, so next question was, why did Chief Justice Gibbs hold, what did they hold in relation to the two claims of damages? So Justice Gibbs said that the plaintiff should be entitled to the loss of profit for the 4 years, but that it was not reasonable for him to continue to incur losses after June 1978. So why was the appeal dismissed then? The appeal was dismissed because Justice Gibbs held that although the full court assessed the damages on an incorrect basis, it had not been established that the damages awarded were insufficient. Okay. In terms of the next question, the final question, so what do each of the judgments say about the effect of Burns's impecuniosity, essentially lack of ability to pay for these repairs, on his obligation to mitigate, so his financial situation, poor financial situation. So in terms of the different judgments, so the majority said that the appellant's impecuniosity was not relevant because it was an issue of remoteness of damage rather than a failure to mitigate. Chief Justice Gibbs said it was relevant and that it would be unjust, because remember, Chief Justice Gibbs saw this as a mitigation issue. Okay, that's why we're looking at it. So Chief Justice Gibbs said it was relevant, so a plaintiff's financial situation was relevant to assessing mitigation, because it would be unjust to prevent a plaintiff from recovering damages caused by a breach of contract because they lacked the means of averting the consequences of a breach. Chief Justice Gibbs also identified that the financial difficulties of the appellant were largely brought about by the respondent's breach. Okay, so that was relevant too. And in dissent, Justice Brennan said that the limitation on loss that would be avoided by mitigation is not so draconian as to deny recovery to an impecunious victim who had no choice but to suffer the loss. Also, reasonableness of the steps taken to mitigate must be assessed in light of the appellant's actual financial circumstances. So reasonableness, financial circumstances is relevant to reasonableness here. Also, Justice Brennan said, or identified that the appellant's impecuniosity was itself caused by or contributed to by the breach. So that was the same as what Chief Justice Gibbs noted. Yeah, so I'll leave that there. So in terms of thinking through the relevance of this case to the materials, remember that mitigation and remoteness can go hand in hand. So make sure you always look at remoteness of loss. I mentioned that in the other video. You know, for every loss, you should be looking at remoteness as well as causation and mitigation if it's relevant on the facts. But also with regards to mitigation, this case kind of, I guess, really does stand for the principle when you're looking at reasonableness, that inability to pay, that failure to pay to avert the losses is relevant, okay, to whether the duty to mitigate has been breached. All right. Okay, thanks guys.